The auctioneer's gavel crashed down, and to Jacob, it felt like the final blow to his soul. Each crack echoed in the hollow silence of the town hall, marking the end of everything he had ever known. Jacob stood at the back of the room, invisible in the shadows, his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles were white. On the stage, bathed in the artificial light, stood his sister, Sarah, and her husband, Mark. They were smiling, shaking hands with a man in a crisp suit. They didn't even glance his way. To them, Jacob was already a ghost, erased from their future just as they had erased the past. The house was gone. His grandfather's house, the one built with calloused hands and a loving heart. The house that smelled of sawdust and old books had just been sold to the highest bidder. It wasn't just wood and nails to him. It was a library of memories, a fortress of his childhood. As the crowd began to disperse, Mark caught his eye. He walked over, his expensive shoes clicking on the polished floor, a smug, triumphant grin plastered on his face. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for Jacob. "It's just business, Jake. You should know that. You can't let sentimentality get in the way of progress." He clapped a condescending hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Don't worry," he added, his grin widening. "Maybe I'll save you a splinter for a keepsake when they tear it all down." Mark turned and walked away, rejoining Sarah, who wrapped her arm around his, her laughter tinkling like broken glass. Jacob stood frozen, the whisper echoing in his ears. A splinter. They were going to tear it down. He felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was rage, and they had no idea what they had just awakened. Jacob's world had been built in that house. He could still remember being a small boy, trailing behind his grandfather, a gentle giant named Arthur, through the rooms. Arthur was a master carpenter, and the house was his masterpiece and his journal. Every floorboard, every hand-carved mantelpiece, held a story. Jacob's favorite place was the workshop in the basement, a sanctuary filled with the earthy scent of cedar and pine. While other kids were playing video games, Jacob was learning how to plane a piece of wood until it was as smooth as silk, how to join two pieces together so perfectly they seemed to grow from one another. His grandfather would often say, "Legacy isn't money, Jacob. Legacy is what you build with your own hands, and the integrity behind it." Sarah had never understood that. She found the workshop dusty and old-fashioned. She preferred them all, the shiny new things that came in boxes, things without history. She saw the house as an asset, a number on a spreadsheet. Jacob saw it as their family's heart. The last few years of Arthur's life were quiet. Jacob would visit every day, sharing coffee, listening to the old stories one more time. One evening, as they sat by the crackling fire in the hearth Arthur had built from river stones, his grandfather had looked at him with a peculiar intensity. "This house has a strong foundation, Jacob," he had said, his voice raspy with age. "It takes care of its own. Never forget that. The truth is always in the foundation." Jacob had nodded, assuming it was just one of his grandfather's poetic metaphors about family and integrity. He never imagined it was a literal warning, a hidden key to a future he couldn't have possibly foreseen. The day they read Arthur's will was the day Jacob's world fractured. He sat in a sterile lawyer's office, the air thick with the smell of paper and false sympathy. Sarah sat opposite him, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, while Mark held her hand, his face a mask of solemn concern. Jacob expected the will to be simple, the house and its contents to be split between them, the only two grandchildren. He had already planned to buy out Sarah's share, even if it took him a lifetime. But the lawyer, a man named Mr. Peterson whom he'd never seen before, cleared his throat and read from the document. To Sarah, the entire estate, the house, the savings, the workshop, everything. Jacob received only a sealed wooden box of his grandfather's old tools and a check for $10,000, described coldly as a gift to start his own life. Jacob was stunned into silence. It made no sense. His grandfather had practically raised him in that workshop. He was the one who shared Arthur's passion, the one who promised to maintain his legacy. Sarah couldn't even hang a picture straight. He looked at his sister, whose tears now seemed suspiciously crocodile-like. "Sarah, what is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mark spoke for her, his tone smooth and rehearsed. "Grandpa changed his mind in his last few months, Jake. He was worried about you. He wanted you to get out from under his shadow, to make your own way. He felt leaving you the house would be a crutch. It was a perfectly crafted lie, a poisoned arrow wrapped in the language of love and concern. Jacob knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not his grandfather's wish. This was a coup, a theft orchestrated with a pen instead of a weapon, and his own sister was the one holding it. In the weeks that followed, Jacob felt like he was drowning in quicksand. Every move he made only pulled him deeper into despair. He hired a lawyer with what little money he had, a tired, overworked man who looked over the documents and sighed. "The will is ironclad, son," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. "The signature is verified. It was witnessed by 2 of your grandfather's nurses. Forgery? Almost impossible to prove. Competency challenge? They'll dismiss you as just a bitter grandson." His friends offered their sympathies, but their advice was always the same. "Maybe Mark is right," one said gently. "Maybe it's a chance for a fresh start." They didn't understand. It wasn't about the money. It was about his grandfather's memory being desecrated. He felt profoundly alone, his grief and anger a toxic cocktail churning inside him. He started to doubt himself. Had he missed something? Had his grandfather truly felt he was a failure? The thought was a physical pain, worse than losing the house itself. He moved into a small, soulless apartment across town, the silence deafening. The $10,000 check sat on his counter, untouched, feeling more like an insult than a gift. One night, unable to sleep, he paced his tiny living room. The city lights a poor substitute for the familiar stars he used to see from his bedroom window. He felt his identity crumbling. Who was he without the house, without the workshop, without the legacy he was meant to protect? Was it even worth fighting for? Was he just being stubborn, as Sarah had always called him? He slumped onto his couch, utterly defeated. Then, from the depths of his memory, his grandfather's voice echoed, quiet but clear. "The truth is always in the foundation." The words didn't offer a solution, but for the first time in weeks, they offered a sliver of something else: purpose. Fueled by that sliver of purpose, Jacob began to fight back, not with lawyers, but with what his grandfather had taught him: meticulous attention to detail. He took out the wooden box of tools, a painful reminder of his loss. Inside, beneath the worn chisels and hand planes, was a small, leather-bound journal. It was his grandfather's. He spent days poring over the entries, searching for anything. And then he found it. A small note from 2 years prior, where Arthur complained about his arthritis, mentioning how his signature was becoming a wobbly mess, and that he now used a specific, slightly simplified version for anything official. Jacob raced to his lawyer's office. They compared the signature in the journal to the one on the will. It was different. The will used his grandfather's older, more elaborate signature, one he hadn't used in years. It was the wobbly mess he had complained about. "This is it," Jacob exclaimed, a surge of adrenaline washing over him. He wouldn't have signed it like this. The lawyer, for the first time, looked hopeful. They filed a motion to contest the will based on the signature discrepancy. Sarah and Mark were forced to appear for a preliminary hearing. For a brief, glorious moment, Jacob saw fear in their eyes. He felt a rush of vindication. He had them. But his victory was short-lived. Mark's expensive legal team was prepared. They produced a handwriting expert who testified that it was common for the elderly to revert to old habits, and that the signature was, in his professional opinion, authentic. Then came the bigger blow. Citing Jacob's erratic and obsessive behavior, they filed for, and were granted, a temporary restraining order, legally barring him from setting foot on the property or contacting Sarah. He had taken his shot and missed. In one move, they beat him and branded him a threat, legally cutting him off from the last piece of his home. The hope he had felt moments before evaporated, leaving a bitter, cold emptiness. The restraining order was a paper wall he couldn't break through. Jacob was forced to watch from a distance as his life was dismantled piece by piece. The first sign was the sleek, corporate for sale sign hammered into the front lawn. But it wasn't just any sale. The sign read, "Future home of the Willow Creek Estates by Apex Urban Development." They weren't just selling the house. They were selling the land it stood on to a massive corporation known for building soulless, high-rise luxury condos. The news hit the local paper. The article featured a picture of a beaming Sarah and Mark shaking hands with the CEO of Apex. The headline read, Local couple paves way for modernization. They were painted as heroes, visionaries bringing progress to the sleepy town. Jacob was mentioned only once, as a distant relative who had unsuccessfully contested the will. He was a footnote in the story of his own family's destruction. Humiliation burned through him. He would drive by at night, parking his car down the street, just to look at the house, its windows dark and empty. It looked like a tomb. One evening, he saw surveyors walking the property, planting small flags in the ground, marking the places where the old oak trees would be torn down, where the foundation he knew so well would be shattered by bulldozers. He felt a profound sense of powerlessness, a crushing defeat that settled deep in his bones. He was completely and utterly isolated. He had lost the legal battle, he had lost the house, and now he was forced to be a silent witness to the complete annihilation of his grandfather's legacy. It felt like watching a funeral from behind a one-way mirror, his grief and rage trapped with no way out. The fall was complete. He had nothing left. Alone in his apartment, surrounded by the silence of his failure, Jacob hit rock bottom. For days, he did nothing but exist, the untouched check on his counter a monument to his defeat. He had lost. It was over. But in the depths of that despair, a strange clarity began to emerge. The anger and the grief started to recede, leaving behind the cold, hard bedrock of his grandfather's memory. What had he missed? He kept coming back to that final conversation by the fire. The truth is always in the foundation. He had taken it as a metaphor. Then he thought it was a clue in a journal. But what if Arthur, the master builder, meant it literally? What if the secret wasn't on paper, but in the house itself? Jacob's mind, trained since childhood to think in terms of structure, of support, of what lies beneath, began to race. He couldn't get on the property, but he didn't need to. He needed to understand how it was built. He spent the next week at the town records office, digging through dusty archives. He pulled the original building permits for the house from over 60 years ago. He found blueprints, material manifests, and inspection reports. He spread them out on the floor of his small apartment, creating a map of his past. He cross-referenced everything with his grandfather's journals, looking for any anomaly. For days, he found nothing. Then he saw it. A single-line item on a material receipt from a salvage yard, dated a week before they poured the foundation. 1. Historic granite cornerstone, EST 1880s. It was an odd purchase. Why would his grandfather bury a 100-year-old cornerstone in a new foundation? He flipped frantically through the journal until he found the corresponding date. The entry was short and cryptic. Some things are worth more than money. Some things must be preserved, even if it means hiding them in plain sight. Today, I gave the old post office a new, quiet home, a foundation for the future built on the bones of the past. The town's original post office had been demolished that same year. Its cornerstone was a registered historical artifact that had mysteriously vanished. His grandfather hadn't stolen it. He had saved it. He had hidden it. In the foundation, a new kind of energy surged through Jacob, sharp and focused. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about justice. His grandfather had left him one last tool, and he was finally ready to use it. Jacob's strategy shifted from emotional reaction to calculated action. He was no longer a grieving grandson. He was a tactician. He made a detailed file, compiling the salvage yard receipt, the blueprint showing the exact placement of the foundation's main support pillar, the journal entry, and the town's own records about the missing historic cornerstone. The pieces fit together perfectly. The cornerstone wasn't just buried. It was an integral part of the fireplace hearth support structure in the center of the house, the very foundation his grandfather had spoken of. Under state law, a structure containing a designated historical artifact could not be altered or demolished without a full review and approval from the State Historical Preservation Office. Demolition was, for all intents and purposes, impossible. His first move was a quiet one. He made a formal submission to the Preservation Office, presenting his case not as a family squabble, but as a concerned citizen who had discovered a matter of historical importance. He was calm, professional, and factual. They were intrigued and promised to launch an immediate investigation. His second move was louder. He had a legal notice drafted, not by a tired family lawyer, but by a sharp, aggressive litigation firm that specialized in civic law. The notice was sent via certified mail to 3 parties, Sarah and Mark, the CEO of Apex Urban Development and the Town Planning Board. It formally stated that the property at 112 Oak Street was under review for historical landmark status due to the discovery of a significant artifact within its foundation, and that any and all development or demolition plans were to be halted immediately pending the state's investigation. Jacob imagined the scene when Mark opened that envelope. The smug confidence would have vanished from his face, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then annoyance, and finally, a cold dread. For the first time since this ordeal began, the hunter had become the hunted. Jacob wasn't just fighting back anymore. He was setting a trap, and the bait was his enemy's own greed. The house was starting to take care of its own. The emergency meeting at the town planning office was a scene of barely concealed panic. On one side of a long, polished table sat the executives from Apex Development, their faces grim. Beside them, looking small and pale, were Sarah and Mark. On the other side sat Jacob, his lawyer, and two representatives from the State Historical Preservation Office. The CEO of Apex spoke first, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a ridiculous, last-ditch effort to stall a multi-million-dollar project. A fantasy cooked up by a disgruntled relative." Mark nodded eagerly. "My brother-in-law is imaginative. There is no cornerstone. Arthur would have told us." Jacob remained silent, letting their arrogance fill the room. Finally, the lead investigator from the preservation office, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke. "We have reason to believe the claim is credible." She laid out Jacob's evidence on the table: the receipt, the journal entry, the historical records. "However," she continued, "the only way to be certain is with a non-invasive inspection. We have a team on standby with ground-penetrating radar. With your permission, we can have our answer in under an hour." The Apex executives exchanged nervous glances. They had already sunk a fortune into this project. Seeing no other choice, they agreed. Everyone convoyed to the house. The tech team swept their equipment over the stone hearth of the fireplace, the heart of the home. A wireframe image appeared on their monitor. For a moment, there was nothing but stone and concrete. Then, the operator adjusted the frequency. The scan revealed a perfect square, dense and solid, exactly where the blueprints predicted. And on its surface, faint but undeniable, were the words, U.S. Post Office, 1888. A collective gasp went through the room. The Apex CEO swore under his breath and walked out, already on the phone with his legal team. Sarah stared at the screen, her face ashen. All the color had drained from Mark's face. He looked at Jacob, his eyes wide with disbelief and raw hatred. Jacob finally stood up, his voice steady and clear, echoing in the silent room. "My grandfather had a saying," he said, looking directly at his sister. He said, "True wealth isn't in what you sell, but in what you choose to preserve, for those who come after you." You chose money. He chose history. He chose to build his foundation on something that would last. The revenge was complete. It wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, elegant, and absolute, executed with his grandfather's own hidden wisdom. The fallout was swift and brutal. The Apex Development deal imploded spectacularly. Citing fraud and non-disclosure, they sued Sarah and Mark for the full extent of their preliminary investment and damages, a sum well into the seven figures. The bank, seeing the property was now worthless as a development site and tied up in legal battles, called in the loan they had taken out against it. Within 6 months, they were financially ruined, forced to declare bankruptcy. Their reputation in the town they had tried so hard to impress was shattered. They sold their luxury cars, their designer clothes, and eventually moved away in the dead of night, buried under a mountain of debt and public shame. The house, now a protected landmark, fell into foreclosure. But Jacob, with the help of a loan from the Historical Society and a group of local investors who admired his dedication, was able to buy it back from the bank for a fraction of its former price. The restraining order was a distant memory, a meaningless piece of paper from a life that no longer existed. He didn't move back in alone. He reopened his grandfather's workshop and, in partnership with the local community college, turned the entire property into the Arthur Vance Memorial Workshop, a nonprofit school for aspiring young woodworkers and craftsmen. The house was once again filled with the smell of sawdust and the sounds of creation. It was more alive than ever. Standing on the porch one evening, Watching the sunset paint the sky, Jacob finally understood the full weight of his grandfather's words. His legacy wasn't just the house. It was the spirit of building something meaningful. True wealth isn't what you can sell, but what you choose to preserve. Thank you for listening to our story. We hope it brought you a sense of satisfaction and justice. If you have a story of your own where karma played its part, we'd love to read about it in the comments below. What do you think Sarah and Mark's life is like now? Let us know your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories of revenge and karma every day.